Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. The legislature convenes in Austin this week for the 140-day biennial legislative session amidst ample speculation about what this session is going to look like, at least among those paying attention. We'll talk about that some today, and we'll touch on the results from a poll that we conducted in December and released without the usual propagation efforts right before Christmas, though we got a little coverage from those who were still working when we released that poll. So I'm joined again today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back to the first podcast of the new year, Josh.
Oh, I'm very excited. As I said to you this morning, it's nice not to be talking about elections.
Yeah, as we talk a lot, we have probably even in the podcast, we get really, really tired of talking about elections, and then elections are over, and we're really happy to talk about legislative politics, and then
it happens.
By about May, we'll be going, God, is this thing almost over? Although I think we're a little less subject to that than we are to being sick of elections, honestly.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's more happening. There's actual day-to-day things that are happening and that we can, react to. Whereas elections, it's a lot of oh, there's an internal poll, and it's
Right. It's sort of like the same bitching over
and over again. Yeah.
So, as we're recording this probably about an hour or so before the legislature gavels into session. And rather than start at the heart of the legislature, I thought I'd start with the big news yesterday, which is still going to ripple through and has huge implications for the legislature. Let's start with the Comptroller, Glenn Hager's updated budget revenue estimate, which, for those of you that are listening, I don't really need to explain, but basically, as for those of you that may have just randomly listened to this podcast, of which I think there are very few of you, the Comptroller is obligated to provide the legislature with an estimate of the revenue that they have to spend, and then on the back end, the Comptroller will have to basically ratify what is in the budget as corresponding to the correct numbers. And for those of you, I would name a couple of people, but I won't. There are those of you that will correct me on the specifics of that. That's the broad arc. I know that we could add a lot more to that.
Yeah.
But it's a nice starting point. So in his much anticipated reporting of the pre-legislative BRE as the legislature gets underway, Comptroller Hager provided very good fiscal news to the legislature, more or less, right? He increased the amount of funds available as the beginning balance for the legislature to work with, at least the balance in excess from the previous session, to $32.7 billion, a historic high, and an increase from the already historic $27 billion that we had been kicking around and that was in a headline even this morning, I think, from somebody that hadn't kept up. That was in the last BRE that the Comptroller provided. So the projection is that the ledge will have $188.23 billion available, and it is pretty amazing when you compare that to the $149 billion and change that they had going into the 22-23 session,
which was a pretty good amount of money then.
Yeah, we went through a version of this
as an aside,
last time.
It was 120 before. It's been increasing pretty substantially.
Right, and amidst all of these sort of confounding expectations over the impact of the pandemic and COVID, and of course, last time we had a big tranche of federal money in play.
Right.
So where to start? I think a few observations, points of discussion. At the broadest possible sense, right? It feeds the ongoing sense that there will be money to spend and a lot of ideas in the Capitol building about how to spend it as we are convening. And you and I talked about this. I found Hager's tone and messaging on this interesting, as always, in the way that the controller, I think, is one of the, sort of lesser appreciated players in the drama of Texas politics right now. Now, I think that's changing a little bit.
It's such an interesting position, right? I mean, in some ways, every time, we've had the controller to campus. We've learned about this over time. I think, somewhat close up. And in some extent, you sort of, at least as an outside observer, I'm always sort of struck by what a crazy job this is, right? In the sense of what we're, at least this is the most public thing that we ask the controller to do. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff that the controller's office does, but this is the most public. And it's, and I think I'm always struck by this, this is clearly a political position. It's an elective office, but it's one of the few elective offices where, you really kind of have to get it right.
That's funny. It's a funny way of putting that.
And if you and look, and we know what happens when you don't, right? I mean, we've seen that. You end up becoming, basically, the butt of jokes for a while, and I won't do anything or say anything to that effect.
Right. I would say go Google Erica Greeter and Susan Combs, and you'll see what we mean.
Exactly. And so it's sort of this odd position where I think, you can sort of occasionally be drawn out of the notion that it's a political position, but then, you have something like, I think, the announcement of the BRE yesterday, and it still sort of reminds you, well, this is still a political position, right?
Right. And just to, elaborate that only slightly, I mean, when you start really looking at the role the controller plays in, managing the state's position in the bond market, there's a lot going on here that is really important. But, you're right. This is one of those moments when the political nature of the office really pops up. And so I think there was a lot of interesting text and context in the controller's announcement yesterday. I mean, and this has been consistent with the way that Controller Hager's run the office and operated in the office over his couple of terms. He has been a voice through a lot of the uptick in state income that you've been that we were just talking about,
especially in the rainy day fund,
saying, "Hey, let's be careful,
right?
Let's not get carried away. Yeah, this all looks great." Everybody likes to take victory laps over how great Texas is doing and all the money we're bringing in and all the growth, and the specific form of that yesterday, I thought, was that if we're going to have a drinking game with the controller's speech, the phrase "once in a lifetime" would have gotten you pretty inebriated pretty early. Right. So, he kept saying that it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. But in terms of the politics, as you say, the agenda he laid out aligns in a very interesting way with the agendas that we're seeing discussed among other major political actors.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he really highlighted, in investing in the electric grid, which has come up, broadband infrastructure, water infrastructure, some kind of the really meat and potatoes, salary increases for state employees and teachers, and he really prioritized those really before some of the bigger kind of political ones. And I think, and I had this question for you, and I was sort of looking at it and I was saying, is this the reflection of, and I just says real quick, just to reiterate, his once in a lifetime piece on this is correct. Ultimately, we've had a bunch of very strange things happen in the last few years. There's no way we're going to walk into each legislative session with $33 billion, sitting around. So I think, that's true. But then as just sort of an observer, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, is this, Glenn Hager, sort of the comptroller who not only, makes these estimates, but also is responsible for basically writing the checks, right?
Yeah.
And seeing
and keeping an eye on the state's credit rating.
Keeping an eye on the state's credit rating, keeping an eye on, the various workforces in the states and their sizes and all these things. Or is this the reflection of, I was just thinking to myself, someone who clearly aspires to some higher office at some point, looking ahead and saying, guys, don't make a bunch of commitments going forward that we can't keep.
And in a more proactive way, I think, and I suspect that this is something that he would, emphasize, taking a substantive position saying, there's a lot of growth in the state, and he doesn't put it this way, but, we got to keep up.
Right.
And this is an opportunity to do that. He even had stuff about it, skilled workforce in there. So, now, that said,
right,
the controller is swimming in the same waters as the other statewide official that must face the voters and must face Republican primary voters. There was also some language on the impact of immigration, with the required reference to the failure of the Biden administration's policy. So, for the new year, we're introducing some clips into the podcast.
Well, it's not like to make promises, but yeah.
So let's listen to part of what the controller had to say in that context.
Texas must continue to fill the substantial void left by the federal government along our Texas border as people from all over the world continue to pour into our border communities. The federal government's failure is putting tremendous strain on Texas' infrastructure and law enforcement personnel, infringing on the rights of private landowners and depleting state and local resources. And lawmakers should consider meaningful tax reductions to ease the burden of Texans who are grappling with inflation, economic uncertainty, and rising housing costs.
So, fascinating. We can unpack that in any number of ways. I mean, that language is and the call outs there
right,
are very familiar. If you just, we just talked about being sick of the campaign.
Right.
That was a relatively mild form of what we heard up and down the ballot in the campaign.
No, there is a very much, unless I forget, let me make sure to remind you that I, too, very much want to secure the border and lower property taxes. But again, we're sort of, we're very much focused on what's the order, what's the priority of these things, because we're seeing different priorities all over the place. But the point here being, you can't have a priority list without the border.
Right. And without, I don't want to read too much into, one announcement that was physically focused. The focus of this announcement was not this list.
Right.
But nonetheless, this list is in roughly inverse order, not entirely, but roughly inverse order of certainly what we heard from Republican elected officials during the election.
Right.
But also the messaging that we're hearing from other sectors of the Republican Party. It's a nice layout of kind of what the array of, like, what's on the menu, if you will. But, putting property taxes at the very end, and we should say in that excerpt, that was kind of the end of that portion of the speech, that list of priorities that you sort of repeated earlier came first and then was followed by this soundbite, and then he kind of moved on into other topics. And so, saying infrastructure in various ways, and we could even talk about the rank ordering within that list, then immigration, then lastly, tax cuts, kind of, certainly the opposite of, say, what, let me choose a random person, the lieutenant governor has been saying.
Right, or the governor. And I think that's sort of, what I think someone could say from the outset is, well, wait a minute, though. But, if they're all saying the same thing, then what difference does it make? And I'll tell you what difference it makes. For example, if you put property taxes at the top of this list and then say that half of the budget surplus should go to property taxes, as the governor has suggested initially, well, a lot of the money for infrastructure, water infrastructure, pay raises, for state employees becomes a lot more challenging, if not impossible. And so, yes, everybody can agree that this is broadly speaking the list, but the reality is the order of the list really does functionally matter when it comes to what they're actually going to be able to get done.
And some things are more amenable.
Right.
Looking at the list over, are more amenable to one-time seeding expenditures.
Right.
SEEDING, seeding sort of funds or trying to kickstart things, than are others. And, property taxes are kind of forever.
Yeah, well, not only are they kind of forever.
Unless you just there is an idea that, we could just send people a check, but I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
Well, yeah, the give people a check idea kind of sounds like the throw your hands up version of it, which is basically to say, okay, we can't figure out a viable method to do this. And the truth is look, I'm not saying that's not the ultimate outcome here, because what I've been saying to you and a lot of other people is, the second you start talking about trying to fix people's property taxes, you're walking into public school finance real quick and, talk about a committee that's going to have a lot on its plate this session.
Yeah, exactly. So now, I think what this brings us to then is the intersection of this fiscal moment that we're in and the agenda as usual. Now, this is where we say, in between the last podcast we did almost a month ago now, at the end of the year last year, and now we released a poll that we ran in December. And we can talk maybe, I think as we go, we'll probably talk about the poll a little bit. But, one of the things we did in the poll that was typical, there are a lot of atypical things in the poll that we'll get to, was we asked people what's the most important problem facing the state. And those results look pretty familiar.
Yeah, as usual, about a third of voters, in this case just under a third, said that immigration or border security was the most important problem facing the state of Texas. That was the plurality choice, so no other issue top that. And when we look, in the crosstabs, we found 60% of Republicans, 6-0, right? 6 and 10, a bunch of ways to say this, who said immigration or border security is the top issue facing the state. So ultimately, you can't miss the target as a Republican elected official by talking about immigration or the border, because it just encumbers the majority of Republicans in poll after poll after poll. The only exception was at the immediate onset of COVID. We saw a shift, and it wasn't even a total shift. We're not saying that people said, Republicans all of a sudden, oh no, we don't care about the border's not an issue. No, it's still an issue.
Yes. Much less than a shift and only slightly more than a blip.
Right. And I think, this is one of those things I always think I say this, I'm sure if you've heard this podcast, you heard it before, I'll say it quick, but it takes about 5 or 6 of the Democrats' top issues to get to 60% of Democratic voters. Right. And that just shows, again, if you want to say like, well, was 60% a lot? Yes, it is a lot.
Yeah. So, and just to, to be, I think we can probably come back to this. The two top items among Democrats were political corruption and leadership, not surprisingly given, partisan patterns, and then gun control and gun violence. Right. But that was 22% for political corruption leadership, 14% for gun control and gun violence. So to the extent that you're looking for something to coalesce among Democrats, at least in terms of public opinion, there's not a lot to work with.
It's called a non-starter.
Right. Very well, very difficult. That's the problem. The Democrats have to start on something, but polling is not entirely helpful in terms of an issue focus, I think. And I've been thinking about that a bit, but we can put a pin in that.
Well, I'll say
first pin of the new year.
I'll add one just word. I'll say a mobilizing issue focus, like the border is for Republicans.
So, of course, the continued centrality of immigration and border security as an issue, we're also very front of mind this week. Joe Biden, made his first, and in the mind of Republicans, and I think it's a fair criticism, sort of tardy visit to the border this week. Stopped in El Paso on his way to a summit in Mexico City with his counterparts from Mexico and Canada. A lot of press on that, a lot of, criticism from the usual corners on that stop. The Texas responses to the Biden visit were fairly predictable. Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick both appeared on Fox News and probably other places I missed to criticize Biden's visit variously as a photo op, as too little, too late.
Sanitized, I believe.
That they led to a sanitization of the El Paso streets, although I think that was kind of unevenly accomplished based on various coverage. All kinds of, he didn't meet with migrants, et cetera, all which I think was to be expected. And, look, to be fair, the Biden administration has kind of earned that a little bit. I
think Democrats in general have earned that quite a bit.
And we've said that, and I think that's a fair thing to
There's
observe.
a handful of Texas congressional Democrats who I think probably can escape that criticism, and that's about it.
Right. So, so let's listen. Lieutenant Governor Patrick provided a very interesting kind of leading indicator of how this border security issue might arise as a legislative issue in the upcoming session. And so we talked a lot on the podcast about the sharp increase in state spending on border security. And a couple times we've sort of speculated about how the issue is going to play out in talks about the budget and spending in the next legislature. Now, we got a pretty clear indication from Lieutenant Governor Patrick talking to Fox News on Monday of this week. So let's hear a little bit of that.
We're beginning our session tomorrow, and I've already authorized in our budget, which we've been writing for some time, another $4 billion, and the House has as well, that we're going to spend of Texas taxpayer money again. When Trump was president, we spent about $400 million a year, and now we're spending several billion a year, and that's Texas taxpayer money.
Yeah, that does. So a fairly rich text. Just a short clip, lot in there. Obviously confirms the sense that, given Republican attitudes on immigration and border security, there's no interest in ratcheting down spending. But that was a very clear kind of signal that there's no interest in scaling down from the $4 billion that is kind of, $4 billion plus, that is kind of the current level of spending, which in fact was not actually approved by the legislature last time.
No.
Some of that money came in supplemental approvals, emergency spending, et cetera, after the legislature was long gone. And of course, we both laughed, here. And
I like to say the legislature consented, I suppose, if not outright blessed, but at least
via
implicitly.
But not via the whole body or
No.
via the budget. I mean, I think it was anyway.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, it took some sign off, but there was very little resistance. Let's put
Right.
it that way. But I mean, I think you have to do a little bit of close reading here, and I don't want to overdo this, but the lieutenant governor's choice of words when he says "I have authorized" really underlines what should we call it? His active management and control of the Senate GOP caucus.
That's a nice way to describe it.
We're fair here at the
New
Second
Year.
Reading Podcast.
Try be.
I mean, I was wondering if that was, you and I didn't hear this together, but watching you listen to that clip, I mean, it struck you the same way it struck me, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, that's a lot of money, right, first and foremost. But yeah, I mean, the notion that basically the lieutenant governor is, admitting to the idea of before the process sitting and deciding, what is and is not going to go into the budget, I think, more than surprising is kind of one of the most direct confirmations of the dynamic that we kind of see going on.
I just think the word authorizing does, falls very heavily in that passage.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true.
And in terms of thinking, then kind of going back to where we started in terms of what was going on, what was in the controller's speech
Right.
and the rank ordering. The lieutenant governor released, a statement. I think as the BRE announcement was happening. Maybe shortly after or shortly before, but I think I saw it, I think, immediately after, in which, he made it clear he thought the first priority still should be tax relief for Texans. And what he said was, as I stated previously in my November press conference, another interesting, sort of subjective position, shall we say, Texas taxpayers must first receive tax relief before we commit to any new spending. Unquote. And so, I think, as is often the case, we get very sort of focused on what happens in the building on the first day. And,
Right.
I think you and I both, I don't know if you saw the email before, reporters wanting to say, hey, let's talk about like the committee appointments and
Right.
things like that.
It's like, whoa.
The signaling going on before any of the process
Right.
starts, I think, is really the thing to watch right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, very signal-rich environment right now.
Well, I think that, and just in terms of like the timeline for people who watch this closely, I think some people know this, some people don't. That what you're talking about is a much longer process than people think. It doesn't end when the session starts. It doesn't end when a speaker is appointed. We still have a ways to go in this signaling game that's going on before we
Right.
actually get to where the rubber meets the road and we start to see which bills actually move in committees, what gets substituted, all these different pieces and moving parts, and what kind of is just dying on the vine. And it's like, there's an essence right now, I think, where, people really want to jump ahead and sort of say, okay, what's going to happen? It's like,
Right.
no, it's not about what's going to happen. It's what are we watching?
Right.
Right. And this is what, right now, we're watching the signaling.
And what can we glean from,
What can we glean from the signaling?
And some of that comes from reporting, some of it comes from us, around, whatever. So, I mean, I think,
I say one thing,
yeah.
just on this point. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you take these two pieces here, right, and in some ways, it's interesting. You start with the sort of the breathlessness of the BRE, right, and it's like there's so much money, and your point, early on, it reinforces this sense that like, oh, there's a lot we could do here, a lot of possibilities, but you start to like think about this stuff, and it's like, okay, well. They increased the homestead exemption in the very, very end of the last session and did not have a mechanism to pay for it going ahead. If we didn't have this huge, again, surplus, we would be talking about that. Surely Medicaid was shortchanged. They've got to be made whole, right? That's just perpetual thing. Now, again, normally we talk about the beginning of the session. We're not talking about that because it's just a drop in the bucket of this huge number, right? We're going to do $4 billion in border security. Okay. That's an extra $1 billion over what was appropriated at least last time. That's going to happen, right? But there is a revenue. I mean, there is a spending limit. There are these sort of constraints that have been imposed that they can change. And I would say like any of this can change. But the amount of like money that's out there for all this stuff, it's by the time you even get to property taxes, you're already thinking like, well, how much is left?
like, two things. Like, it's still finite.
Yeah, I mean, right.
Right.
It sounds like a lot.
And I think we've said that we were talking about this at the late last year. On one hand, you have a large but finite amount of money.
Yeah.
Including extra money, quote unquote. but you have a nearly infinite number of supplicants and ideas for that number.
Yes.
For that money. So, so I think that, as we look at where the lieutenant governor was, we look at the controller's focus on infrastructure yesterday, or earlier this week.
Which aligns a little bit more with the speaker, who we haven't talked about that much, but he's
but the speaker's also been, the speaker and the governor have played their cards a little more closely than has lieutenant governor, but that's that itself is a matter of discussion and illustration,
stylistic,
right? And
institutional,
institutional position. I think that's exactly right. But you contrast what the controller had to say, both, and what he gave pride of place and what he also just included. Mm-hmm. With the contrast with the express priority of the lieutenant governor. And it points to familiar tensions within the governing Republican coalition, right? And, I think that tension is interesting. I think we look at it, a lot of times not simply, but a lot of people, we should say, look at this a lot at the elite level mostly in the way that we've done mostly today. We brought in public opinion as the context for this. But there's another context that I think our previous polling, and certainly the December poll, really helped capture, that I think helps explain some of the uncertainty, why there's not a consensus, why everybody's walking around kind of going, well, what are we going to do? What are they going to do? And everyone's not going, no, it's obvious they're doing this. That is, in this very dynamic Texas environment, we're growing fast. We're feeling the pains of that growth. We've talked about that a lot in here. Controller talked about it yesterday. And Texans feel that. I mean, we picked that up in the polling. For example, we've asked a few times whether people think the state's population growth has been good for the state or not.
Right. And when we asked this last year, the plurality of Texans, 40% say it's been bad for the state. 34% said good. And thinking about, again, the governing coalition, go back to elites for a second, a majority of Republicans, 52%, say that population growth has been bad for Texas. And if you think about, the way growth has worked in the state, the urban centers are a big part of this growth, but really it's been the explosion of the suburbs and the expansion of the suburbs out into the exurbs, basically, which, if you've been following Texas politics, it really has, I would say, conditioned a lot of what the political conflict has looked like and where it's taken place. If you're thinking to yourself, what has been the center of political conflict, a lot of it has been around issues that really touch in the expanding suburbs and really, again, the culturally expanding suburbs as the suburbs get bigger and cover more areas. But what we find then is when we say, again, even though this population growth has been really focused in and around Texas cities, 34% of urban voters say the population growth has been bad. More say it's been good. 39% of suburban voters say it's been bad. 50% of rural voters say population growth has been bad for the state of Texas. And so ultimately, you could say that's a pretty broad question, and I agree. And so the question becomes, what's
by design?
Yeah, absolutely. And the question becomes, well, what's bad? But we could break that up. But if you think about some of the likely, candidates here, you're thinking about transportation, you're thinking about housing costs, you're thinking about essentially, the nature of the population change that's going on in the state, right? The effect it's having on local schools and all these things that you can actually kind of link back to the fact that the state is in this, very dynamic place. But also, how do you have a dynamic growing state with a really, limited government, let's just say low taxes, low services model?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that, it is something that, we've looked at in different kind of ways, and it kind of, in terms of putting internal pins on things, figuring out, there are a lot of different sources for that discontent,
right,
or discomfort. Some of, and as you were going through that list, it's interesting. It brings us back to a lot of discussions that we have as we try to figure out what's going on in Texas politics and really what's going on inside the base of the governing coalition, because, there's a Venn diagram here, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, between something that's kind of, we might think of as cultural discomfort,
right,
with this transition, the kind of just basic service provision that you're talking about, and probably some other thing that's even kind of straddling the two of those. You can conceptualize that any number of different ways. We don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but it's out there.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that, in an effort to sort of continue to sort of move the model of conservative governance forward at the statewide level, I think that at the statewide level, they've sort of walked into a little bit of a difficult space, and I don't know if they've realized it yet. So I mean, as we're sitting here talking about a $33 billion budget surplus at the state level, cities that have been in the state have been growing dramatically. Inflation has created a serious pressure on their ability to basically pay for services and I would say increase infrastructure, right? But yet those cities have been capped in the amount of tax revenue that they can actually generate to deal with most of these issues. So what has the result of that been? I mean, in my mind, I think you draw a line to all of the bond propositions that have passed all over Texas. So basically, when you go to Texas voters in any of these cities pretty much and say, hey, we're going to raise your taxes for this. And voters have pretty much unequivocally said, go ahead.
Schools, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. You want to do, I mean, Austin has
Roads,
a huge project.
Transportation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Affordable housing. Okay. And so, ultimately there's a little bit of there's a tension, I think, going on here. And now look, a place like Austin or Dallas, you can do that. Now, the question is that, as you move further out, and we know about this for years, but like the idea being, if you are in some outlying area to one of the major, urban centers that, maybe had a population, let's say under, let's just say under 5,000 somewhere. And all of a sudden, in the last 2 decades, you've doubled or quadrupled. You don't have the water infrastructure. Like, I mean, basic, like the plumbing needs of a community like that. And that kind of capital project is incredibly expensive.
You're rediscovering the traffic that you've either never experienced or that you moved out there to escape.
Well, and you think about it, there's all these stories all over Texas. I'm not saying this is related. There's actually a lot of reasons for this pieces, but all these stories kind of from different places in Texas where it's like, oh, the water is off again.
Yeah.
This is, these are the sorts of things where when Republicans are solely in charge of state government and the water stops working, there's nowhere else to point the fingers. And so I think there is a little bit of a reckoning coming up on some of this stuff that says, hey,
Well, I think the reckoning, this oversimplifies a little bit.
We're not having a reckoning yet.
But I think as well, I think what we're seeing are the signs of a reckoning, right?
Yeah.
Because, and the reckoning, the specific form of the reckoning to my mind that is underlying what we're doing here today. I wish I just said this at the beginning.
Well, this is how we do things.
But it's
in post, we'll put it at the front.
I mean, I think when you are, this goes back to a theme that we've talked about quite a bit, or we come back to, and that is, what is the fallout of a sustained period of one-party rule?
Right.
And in this particular piece, it's how long can you talk about limiting government and getting government out of your life, whether it's, lately it's been, as you kind of imply, state government,
right,
but also making sure, in the transition from the Democratic period to the Republican period, there was a lot of, and with the national foil and the nationalization of politics in the state, a lot of discussion about overweening government being too active. I mean, in the current environment that, if you want to use government to be assertive beyond a very minimal point, you're now called socialist or communist.
Yeah, the weaponization.
But when you are the incumbent party, you have to govern. And so there's limited government impulses and rhetoric and the basic requirements of governance. And I think the rubber's beginning to meet the road and it's hard for me to not look at what we got in the December poll in these questions that registered a lot of widespread discontent with state government, which was fairly new. I mean, the plurality of Texans in that December poll, 46%, said that state government in Austin mostly ignores the needs of Texas residents, while 37% said that it mostly addresses those needs. And when we had asked that 5 years ago in October 2017, without repeating a bunch of numbers, it was roughly inverse.
And let me just add, and without repeating a bunch of numbers, I think one of the most important points about that change, right? So from, more Texans saying that, state government is addressing versus ignoring needs to flip and having more Texans saying that the state is ignoring the needs of residents, is that the vast majority of the deterioration of that attitude came from Republicans.
Right.
Democrats already held negative views of state government. It was among Republicans that we saw this biggest decline in these evaluations. And when we think about right now, this moment that we're in where we're talking about, okay, we've got this big budget surplus and everybody's talking about what they're going to do. Well, a similar question that we asked back in October 17 and again in December, is state government mostly careful or mostly careless with people's tax dollars? And here we found 48% of Texans, almost a majority, said that the state is careless. Only 31% say they're careful. Again, this was a flip back in 2017. 44% said they were careful. 37% said mostly careless. And again, the deterioration came among Republicans. And that is something that I think, is just something to keep an eye on. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on this. We've been asking about, I think one of the things that we've done a bunch here is we've asked about border security spending, as that border security spending keeps going up and up and up. And one of the things we were wondering, just as a question, is there a point at which, the sort of the rhetoric of fiscal conservatism and, the reality of, $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion keeps adding up on border. At some point, do people say, we're spending enough on the border? And especially do Republicans say that? And we've never seen that in the specific case when we ask about it. Every time we've asked, regardless of the increase in spending, the plurality or majority response among Republicans is that the state is spending too little on border security. But it's interesting when we take a step back and just say, but generally speaking, your impression of the state stewardship of your tax dollars, not good.
Yeah, and I think that, so as we look at this session unfolding, we've talked a lot about, and it's now the set piece of understanding Texas politics, and it should be, which is, the power and the gravity of the attitudes and the mobilization of the universe of GOP primary voters, right? But the question now, I think, twirling around that is related, is a different aspect of a question that we've been asking for a while, which is, what is the political identity of conservatives in this moment?
Yeah.
And how has all of that reconfigured in Texas in a way that on one hand reflects this powerful national polarization and nationalization of politics and of the rhetoric inside the Republican Party, which was on display in the big speaker fight in Washington, D.C. In pretty stark terms, and the reality of the collision between the growth patterns in the state and the fact that the Republican Party owns the state right now and has to find, a point at which they can reconcile, or is challenged to find the point at which they can reconcile that kind of national rhetoric and that energy from the base and the follow-up on rhetoric that has been so predominant in Republican politics about limited government and getting the government off your back, and anything government does is probably oppressive to you in some way or another if you just scratch hard enough, to the fact that there are functions that state government plays.
Right.
That burden is increasing with growth.
Mm-hmm.
And, now you have to, we may be reaching a watershed point on that. That watershed point may be, as the controller implied yesterday, an empirical fact.
Right.
But then you have to sort of convey that somehow.
Well, and the other thing is, what everybody who watches the legislature will remind you is anything big at the legislature is going to take multiple sessions.
Right.
And what we're talking about here, I think, is the sort of thing where, these sort of undercurrents that we're talking about, I don't think they're going anywhere, and I think there's every reason to expect them exacerbating. What's interesting in the varying, messaging you're hearing from the major players around this, in some ways you can take a step back, and this is actually, I think, a different take that I'm hearing in a lot of places now that we're kind of arriving at it, which is just say, there's this sort of question about, okay, looking ahead, we definitely need to deal with some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But, the question becomes, and this is always, I think, the question, but are the politics of the right now just too powerful a force to allow for anything more than incremental steps? But I think to the comptroller's point, look, you're not going to have another $30 billion budget surplus to do infrastructure next session.
Right. And I think that, in a sense that I think, as people continue to ask, well, what's the agenda? And who's going to have the upper hand? And look, it's fair to say, is it going to be more like 2019 or more like 2021, which is, I think, a reasonable way to frame it.
Sure.
That gives you some kind of empirical referent. But I think that is actually the clash right now, right?
Yeah.
That is going to be what's going to determine, however you want to think about it, whatever frame you use, that's going to determine where we land between 2019 and 2021, or where you're going to land between, red meat, let's just focus on, beating the most conservative session again versus, trying to govern and trying to do some of these things that are not, don't activate the base and presumably activate some degree of resistance within the Republican Party. And that's really kind of, I think at the end of last year, I was talking about it in terms of, the developmental sort of impulse versus,
Right.
This other, the more ideological impulse. I still think that that's kind of what we're looking at. But I think, this last week, the stuff we're talking about today does help clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think, interestingly enough, I think the contrast between what's going on here in Texas and what's been going on in Washington the last week or so really does also point, to that fact. Whereas, you can be a Republican and you can go to Washington and you can basically spend a legislative career trying to dismantle the system.
Right.
It's kind of hard to do that in Texas because it's not that much of a system to begin with, besides its size. And also, Republicans are responsible for, making sure that the water's clean and that the electricity and the lights stay on and all these other things that need to happen.
Yeah. You have to govern.
Right.
I think
you can't just run for elections and
I think, there's this notion of governing less and governing more, but I think we've inherited now, a lot of governing less.
Yeah.
And I think, I probably agree with the controller that this is kind of a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, once in a lifetime.
So on that, I wish we had that Talking Heads song to put on here, but we'd probably need to get permission. With that, a good start to the session.
Yes.
So if you have thoughts on this, you know where to find us. And so with that, we'll wind it up. Thanks again to Josh for being here. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin, and for, in particular, queuing up some of those excerpts on short notice. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.